had been very bad. Chapter 9 of a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beatrix Potter. I have made many books about story about two disagreeable people called Tommy Brock Todd Nice. The rabbits could not bear him. He was of a wandering habit, and he had foxy whiskers. He was living in a stick house in the coppice, causing terror. One day he moved into a pollard willow near the lake, frightening the wandering. He might generally be found in an earth amongst the rocks. He had half a dozen houses, but he was seldom Mr Todd moved out, because sometimes Tommy Brock moved in. Was a short, bristly, fat, waddling person with a was not nice in his habits. He ate wasp nests by moonlight, digging things up. His clothes were very bed in his boots, and the bed which he generally went. Now Tommy Brock did occasionally eat rabbit pie. It was really scarce. He was friendly with old Mr Bouncer. They often talked over that painful subject. Sat in the spring sunshine outside the burrow in a muffler, son Benjamin Bunny, and his daughter-in-law Flopsy, who had the family that afternoon, because Benjamin and Flopsy had gone off to open their blue eyes and kick. They lay in a fluff separate from the main rabbit hole. To tell the truth, son, and conversed cordially with Tommy Brock, who was part digging, and some mole traps. He complained bitterly Todd of poaching them, and the otters had cleared off all the frogs. A meal for a fortnight. I am living on pig nuts, Tommy Brock. It was not much of a joke, but it tickled Jumpy and grinning. So old Mr Bouncer laughed of seed cake and a glass of my daughter Flopsy's cowslip hole with alacrity. Then old Mr Bouncer smoked, which was so very strong that it made Tommy Brock grin more than ever. Bouncer coughed and laughed, and Tommy Brock puffed and grinned his eyes because of the cabbage smoke. When Benjamin, Tommy Brock, and all the young rabbit babies not confessed that he had admitted anybody into the rabbit hole, but there were round, heavy footmarks in the sand. He slapped him. Benjamin Bunny set off at once, tracking him. He had left his footmark and gone slowly, rooted up the moss and wood sorrel. There he had dug quite a stream across the way. Benjamin skipped lightly over the mud. The path led to a part of the thicket where the sea of blue hyacinths, but the smell that made Benjamin stop. Stick house was before him, and for once Mr Todd was out of it. There was smoke coming out of the broken pail that served as his whiskers twitched. Inside the stick house somebody his foot and bolted. He never stopped till he had turned the same way. Upon the top of the wall a sack had caught on a briar. Benjamin climbed on, newly set. He was still upon the track of Tommy Brock. The rabbits were coming out to enjoy the evening air. One of the dandelions. "Cousin Peter! Peter Rabbit! Peter Rabbit!" sat up with pricked ears. "Whatever is Stoat Ferret?" "No, no, no! He's bagged. Seen him?" "Tommy Brock! How many, Cousin Benjamin? Did he come this way? Please tell me, quick!" "I did think they were kicking rather hard for caterpillars. He had a sack with something live in it. I watched him. Tell me from the beginning." Benjamin did so. "Want of discretion for his years," said Peter reflectively. "Alive and kicking, and Tommy Brock has had refreshment." "Which way?" "Cousin Benjamin composed at home in the stick house. He has gone to Mr Todd's other house to leave any message at Sister Cottontail's. He said he and had gone to live on the hill." Peter hid his dandelion. They crossed several fields and began to climb. He seemed to have put down the sack every dozen yards. "Him by the scent. What a nasty person!" said Peter. Halfway up, Cottontail was sitting in her doorway, one black and the others brown. Cottontail asked whether her husband was at home. She replied that Tommy Brock, and pointed to the sack, and seemed doubled up with laughing, said Benjamin Bunny. They climbed up and up. They lived too near the rocks to quarrel with their neighbours. Come on top of bullbanks they went cautiously. The trees grew. Mr Todd had made one of his homes. It was in it. The rabbits crept up carefully, listening and peeping. Prison and a tumble-down pigsty. There was a straw made the window panes glow like red flame, but the kitchen, as the rabbits could see when they peeped through the window. Preparations upon the kitchen table which made him shudder, pattern, and a large carving knife and fork was a partly unfolded tablecloth, a plate, a chair. In short, preparations for one person's supper. Rabbits. The kitchen was empty and silent. Their noses against the window, and stared into the dusk. It was damp and smelly and overgrown with thorns. "Oh, my poor rabbit babies, what a dreadful place! I shall—" They crept up to the bedroom window. It was closed and had recently been open. The cobwebs were disturbed. The room inside was so dark that at first they could make a low, deep, regular snoring grunt. And as somebody was asleep on Mr Todd's bed, curled up under, whispered Peter. Benjamin, who was all of a snores, continued, grunty and regular, from Mr Todd. The sun had set. An owl began to hoot about that had much better have been buried. Rabbit, it was a shocking place and very dark. They were to move the bolt of the kitchen window. They tried to have no use, especially without a light. and listening. In half an hour the moon rose cold upon the house amongst the rocks, and in it the kitchen were to be seen. The moonbeams twinkled on the carving across the dirty floor. The light showed a little door in a wall belonging to a brick oven of that old-fashioned sort that you see. At the same moment Peter and Benjamin noticed that whenever they answer, the young family were alive, shut up. It was a mercy he did not awake Tommy Brock, whose snores clearly was not very much comfort in the discovery. They could live. The little rabbits were quite incapable of letting themselves. After much whispering, Peter and Benjamin decided to dig a tunnel down the bank. They hoped that they might be able to work between the. It was impossible to say whether it was made of earth or flags. Tunnel straight on account of the stones, but by the end of the back scratching upwards, Peter's claws were worn down. That it was morning, sunrise, and that the jays were making him out of the dark tunnel, shaking the sand from his ears. The sun shone warmer on the top of the hill. In the valley, going through. Again from the fields down below in the mist, sharp yelping bark of a fox. Then they did the most foolish thing that they could have done. They end of it under Mr Todd's kitchen floor, in the very worst of tempers. First, he fault, but it was a china plate, the last of the dinner service. Then the midges had been very bad, and he had failed to only 5 eggs, 2 of them addled. Mr Todd, out of humour, he determined to move house. First he took a dead fish near it. Mr Todd likes nobody's. His temper was not improved by noticing the unmistakable grubs up the moss so wantonly as Tommy Brock. He guessed where Tommy Brock had gone to. It flew from tree to tree and scolded, warning it was coming up the plantation. Once when it flew screamed, he approached his house very carefully with a large bristled. The house was locked up, but Mr Todd's key in the lock. The rabbits below could hear it. That met Mr Todd's eyes in Mr Todd's kitchen made there, and Mr Todd's pie dish, and his knife and left folded up in the dresser, all set out for supper. Brock. There was a smell of fresh earth and dirty rabbit. But what absorbed Mr Todd's attention? Snoring, grunting noise coming from his own bedroom door. Then he turned and came out of the house in a hurry, end with rage. For the next 20 minutes Mr Ting hurriedly out again. By degrees he ventured further in the house. He scratched up the earth with fury, but when he was he was lying on his back with his mouth open, fully and regularly, but one eye was not perfect. Twice he brought his walking stick, and once he brought in the coal. When he came back after removing the coal scuttle, Tom was sounder asleep. He was incurably He was simply too lazy and comfortable to move. He stood a minute watching Tommy Brock and listening attentively. Seemed quite natural. Mr Todd turned his back towards the bed, turned round with a jump. Tommy Brock, who had opened one. Mr Todd's proceedings were peculiar and rather uneasy. He opened the window a little way and pushed out. The rest of the line, with a hook at the end, remained in his hand. Mr Todd stood and looked at him for a minute. Then he looked at the rope and grinned. There was a noise. Mr Todd had gone out the front door and round the burrow. If he had had any idea who was in it, went through the tunnel nearly upon the top of Peter Rabbit Brock's work. He took up the coil of line from the tree. Tommy Brock watched him with one eye through the window. A large, heavy pailful of water from the spring. Tommy Brock snored industriously, with rather a sned, took up the end of the rope with the hook, head almost apoplectic, but the grin was not quite shared by the head of the bedstead. His legs were dangerous. Put the end of the rope with the hook over the head of the tester bed up and put away, owing to the house being unoccupied. So was the counter. Mr Todd, standing on the unsteady chair, looked down upon him, a sleeper. It seemed as though nothing would wake him, not even safely from the chair, and endeavoured to get up again with the pail of water over the head of Tommy Brock, in order to make a sort. Naturally, being a thin-legged person, though vindictive and sandy, the level of the hook and rope, he very nearly overbalanced, more apoplectic, one of Tommy Brock's hind legs peacefully. Mr Todd and the pail descended from the. He emptied the water into a wash basin and jug, it up, wobbling over the head of Tommy Brock. Surely down and up on the chair. As he could not, and ladled quarts of water into the pail by degrees, like a pendulum. Occasionally a drop splashed over, moved, except one eye. At last, Mr Water, the rope was tightly strained over the top of the bed. It will make a great mess in my bedroom, some sort, said Mr Todd. Mr Todd took a large went out of the house, shutting the front door. The rabbits heard the house, intending to undo the rope, in order to. I will wake him up with an unpleasant surprise. Tommy Brock got up in a hurry. He rolled Mr Todd's dress instead of himself, and left the room also, grinning in fire, and boiled the kettle. For the moment he did not trouble himself. He found that the weight and strain had dragged the knot so as to gnaw it with his teeth. He chewed and gnawed for more, a sudden jerk that it nearly pulled his teeth out, and quite a crash and splash, and the noise of a pail. Mr Todd was mystified. He sat quite still. The water was dripping from the bed. Under the blanket was a wet, flattened something across the tummy. Its head was covered by the wet blanket. There was nothing stirring, and no sound except the mattress. Mr. Todd watched it for half an hour, and became so bold that he even tapped at the window. But it had turned out even better than he had planned. Him dead! "I will bury that nasty person and dry it in the sun," said Mr. Todd. "I will bleach, and the blanket must be hung up in the wind, and the bed pan and warmed with a hot water bottle. I will get and soda and scrubbing brushes and Persian powder to have a disinfecting. Perhaps I may have to burn sulphur. First I will arrange a hole, then I will drag out." Tommy Brock was sitting at Mr. Todd's kitchen table, Mr. Todd's teacup. He was quite dry himself, spilling tea all over Mr. Todd. Then Mr. grappled with Mr. Todd amongst the broken crockery. To the rabbits underneath it sounded as if the floor would. They crept out of their tunnel and hung about amongst the rocks, and racket was fearful. The rabbit babies in the oven were. Everything was upset except the kitchen table and the kitchen fender. The crockery was smashed, and the clock fell off with a crash, and there were handfuls of these. The canisters fell off the shelf, the kettle fell off the hob, and the boiling water out of the kettle fell. Tommy Brock, who was still grinning, happened to be uppermost, out the door. Then the snarling and worrying went on out over the rocks. There will never be any love lost. The coast was clear. Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Bunny came out and "Run in and get them while I watch the door." But "No, they are not." "Yes, they are." Stone quarry. Still Benjamin hesitated. "And pat the oven door, Cousin Benjamin, so that he won't miss them." At home in the rabbit hole things had not been quite comfortable. Old Mr. Bouncer had passed a sleepless night, and quarrelled to deny that he had invited company into the rabbit hole. The day passed heavily. Old Mr. hated with a chair. Flopsy had taken away his pipe, turn out, and spring cleaning to relieve her feelings. She was wondering anxiously what she would do next. He picked his way to the oven nervously through a thick cloud outside, and found something warm and wriggling. "I've got them! Can we get away? Shall we hide, Cousin Peter?" Fighting still echoed in the wood. 5 minutes afterward, Banks, half carrying, half dragging a sack between them, safely, and burst into the rabbit hole. Great was Peter and Benjamin arrived in triumph with the young, very hungry. They were fed and put to bed. A fresh supply of rabbit tobacco was presented to Mr. Bouncer. Old Mr. Bouncer was forgiven, and they all had dinner. Not waited long enough to be able to tell the end of the battle. End of The Tale of Mr. Todd. 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 Tale of Mr Tod. 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 Tale of Mr Tod.